the Great Katanas are quite possibly the best new weapon type that have been added into Eldenring, and that's mainly due to the fact that all three of them have a ridiculously high base damage output, as well as having a ridiculous range with their incredibly large blades. But of course, each and every one of them has their own unique abilities, and the one that we're going to be going through today is the truly devastating Rakshasa Great Katana, as it can delete bosses in literal seconds with its crazy Ash of War, as well as its innate bleed build-up. So yes, this katana and the build around it is stupidly powerful, and I guess without any more dilly-dallying, let me show you how you can make this for yourself. Now, just before I let you guys know of all of the stats and the talismans, etc., I did just want to let you know of the crucial items that we need for this build. Of course, one of those items is being the blade itself, but for this build we're also going to be pairing it with the unique Rakshasa armor set, and luckily both of those things are dropped by the same enemy. The reason why we're going to use this armor specifically is because for every piece of armor that we wear, we'll be getting an additional 2% extra damage, which means we can get an 8% boost to our overall damage output just by simply wearing the full set. And I mean, it also looks pretty damn cool too. But it is a little bit of a trek to go and get to these items, because you need to defeat Rakshasa, who is located in the nameless Eastern Mausoleum. And in order to get to this mausoleum, you need to go through a hidden path in the Shadow Keep to have access to the waterfalls underneath Boney Village. So I am just obviously going to show you how you get to said location. The best way to start this journey is to go to the main Gate Plaza site of Grace, which, spoiler alert, is the site of Grace where the giant hippopotamus boss is located inside of Shadow Keep, because essentially from that site of Grace you can work your way to this specific area of the Shadow Keep. So just before going into the storehouse, instead of going forward to the storehouse, if you turn right, there will be a sneaky little ladder that's hiding away from you. Go down said ladder to then find a second ladder, which again you need to go down, and you'll come to this room with the painting. But we're not interested in the painting, because if you hit this wall on the right, you will open up a hidden area with a coffin that you can use to go to the very bottom of the Shadow Keep. And then here you'll be out in the open just next to the ruins of Unte, but essentially we need to keep going past this ruins and follow the waterfalls down. And if you simply follow the path that I'm going to be showing you on screen, I am probably going to speed it up, but feel free to obviously slow it down using the YouTube player if you want to. But realistically, it is just sort of a straight shot, and there's a relatively easy path to follow, but you do need to jump down even further into the canyon down below, where you can keep to the east side of this canyon, and again following this sort of like shallow water path, you will then come to the Eastern Nameless Mausoleum. Inside this mausoleum is going to be the little mini boss that we need to take down, being obviously Rakshasa themselves. And after you successfully defeat this mini boss, you will then obtain both the weapon and the armor set that we are of course using for this build. Now, just to let you know, the Rakshasa's Great Katana has a few little hidden features that I of course want to highlight for you guys, so then that way you have a full understanding of how the weapon works. But essentially it has a very unique Ash of War called the Weed Cutter, which swings the sword in that kind of motion, if you can imagine you being in some sort of farmland, cutting down all of the wheat and weeds, basically slicing through anything it touches. Now, this Ash of War does also grant you hyper armor, and where the actual FP cost of it is only 8, you can essentially do this for a very, very long time. And as much as it's fantastic that you've got hyper armor to basically spam this Ash of War as much as you like, the more important thing to note out is when you use this Ash of War, or when you attack in general with this weapon, you do actually take an additional 10% damage from whatever damage source hits you. So yes, by using this weapon there is a bit of a trade-off. It does obviously fantastic damage, and like I say, grants hyper armor with its Ash of War, but you do take the additional damage only when you're attacking. It's not all the time, but realistically with simple things like Golden Vow, Black Flames Protection, or even just simple talismans like the Dragon Crest Talisman, they can all obviously negate the extra damage that you're taking, so this can be cancelled out relatively easily. But as I've mentioned already in the background, this weapon is truly devastating, because the best thing about this weapon is it's all pure physical damage. It doesn't do any elemental attacks, which means the damage that you're seeing me deal in the footage in the background is transferable against every single enemy. And just to give you a bit of reference for the gameplay in the background, this is from New Game Plus 2, so yes, it's not quite that high into the New Game Pluses, but even still I'm doing around about 2000 damage every time we use a charged heavy attack, which is also what's causing us to break our enemies' poises super easily, which just adds to how broken this weapon actually is. But of course, before we delve into all of that, I should let you know of the stats that we're running for this particular build. So here they are on screen for you, and again, as always, is a level 150 character, and as you can see, we've got 50 points into Vigor, 11 Mind, 24 Endurance, 24 Strength, 70 Dexterity, 9 Intelligence, 33 Faith, and then 8 Arcane. And again, just to sort of explain those stats a little bit more for you, the 11 Mind, 9 Intelligence, and 8 Arcane are all of my base stats. I started this character off as a Samurai, which is why those stats are as they are, but realistically, you can start this character with any starting class that you want, because of course, as you can see, we delve most of our points into Dexterity. That's due to the fact that when you upgrade this weapon to a plus 10, you will have a B rated scaling in Dexterity, while still having a D rated scaling in Strength. So basically, Dexterity is where we're getting all of this crazy power from, and although this weapon does deal bleed damage, it does not have an Arcane scaling, which is why we did not delve into Arcane at all. But more importantly, the 33 Faith that we have in the build is enough to run both Golden Val and also Howl of Shibiri to give us the plus 15% and the plus 25% extra damage boost respectively. And as usual, I do know that you guys delve a little bit higher than me into your levels, so if you are running around about a level 200 build with this weapon, here are the stats that I recommend that you increase, and realistically, I advise that you improve your Vigor up to 60, just to again give you a little bit more survivability, before then making your Dexterity 80, which is of course the final soft cap for that stat and this weapon, before then pumping the rest into Strength, which will give you 54 points into Strength. Realistically, with this weapon, we just want to be getting the best damage output possible, and where it only scales with Dexterity and Strength, by the time that you hit 80 Dexterity, you'll only be getting plus 1 extra AR every time you level that up, so at that point, it's better to then delve into Strength. But whether you go into the level 200 build or a level 150 build, these are going to be the talismans that I recommend that you run with this weapon. So first of all, we're going to be running the two-handed talisman, because whenever we two-hand this weapon, we will be getting a plus 15% extra damage boost, and of course I recommend two-handing this weapon all the time so you can have that buff active all the time. But then I also highly recommend that you run both Millicent's Prosthesis and also the Rotten Winged Insignia, because not only will you get a plus 5 to Dexterity, which is handy if you're in a level 150 build, but you will get both of the consecutive damage output buffs, which can be triggered by usual light attacks, and also the Ash of War, which can of course make that Ash of War extremely devastating, because if you can trap your enemies and keep them in that Ash of War, you will essentially be increasing the damage every time that you hit them. And then of course, again, to make the Ash of War even more deadly, we can then run the Shard of Alexander as our final talisman. And then just to finally round off the build, we of course have the Wonder Physick, and I highly recommend that you run the combination of the Thorny crack tier as well as the Stone Barb crack tier to not only give ourselves another boost to successive damage output, but to also increase our stance damage by 30%. Again, whilst I've been talking and explaining the stats, etc., you've probably seen many different boss fights, and you've probably noticed that it only takes 2 or 3 charged heavy attacks for us to break enemies' poises, and this goes for pretty much all bosses, which is yet another reason why this weapon is so devastating, because essentially you can do a setup where you break your enemy's poises by just using those heavy attacks at the beginning, maybe use 1 or 2 uses of the Ash of War to proc the successive damage output, do the riposte to again just deal thousands of damage with that, and if for whatever reason your enemies aren't defeated yet, you just rinse and repeat that same process. As I mentioned earlier, this weapon also has a bleed proc, but when using this weapon, I would highly recommend that you don't rely on that bleed effect, which is why we're not really running any talismans or any other armor pieces that help with bleed procs, because essentially that will happen every so often, and I would say treat that as kind of like a little extra bonus damage you get every now and again, because the real thing that we are focusing on are those charged heavies and the unique Ash of War, as well as just hitting our enemies with a regular light attack every now and again to keep the pressure on them. And although I haven't showed footage of me taking on any DLC bosses, mainly because I don't want to spoil it for those of you that haven't played it yet, I can confirm that this weapon does transfer very well into the DLC fights, especially if if your Shadow Tree rating is at its highest, because your damage output will be closer to 6,000 or 7,000 every time you hit your enemies with a charged heavy attack, and of course you'll still have the same success with breaking your enemies' poises, making this truly one of the most devastating builds in the entire game. And so, just like that, that is how you create the ultimate build around the Rakshasa Great Katana. And as much as that's a bit of a tongue twister to say, it is very straightforward to use and extremely deadly, and I highly recommend trying it out if you haven't done so already. I know Great Katanas were getting a bit of stick because they're obviously extremely slow compared to their much smaller family members being the regular katanas, but the reason why they're so slow is because they deal so much damage. I mean, could you imagine if we were dealing these numbers with a regular katana? And before you say Rivers of Blood exists, I know, but could you imagine those numbers just being the regular attacks with a katana? Yeah, that is nuts. So that's why these things had to be sort of balanced in some way, but even though it is relatively slow to pull off most of the attacks, it is extremely damning, and I would just treat this as a regular strength weapon. Of course, saying all that, if you have tried any of the Great Katanas, let me know what you think. Are you a fan of them? Do you use them on a regular basis? Because I'm always intrigued to know what your thoughts are on these specific builds. And of course, as always, if you've got any ways to improve this build, feel free to let me know of any suggestions down in the comments, because I'm sure there's going to be many of you looking for alternative ways to use this weapon. But whilst you're down there, you know the drill. If you happen to like this video, if you don't mind me asking you to leave a like rating down below, that would be greatly appreciated, as not only does it help out the channel tremendously, but it also lets me know that you want to see more overpowered builds like this. And if you're new around here and you're still sticking around, or you find yourself coming back to the channel and you're not subscribed, make sure you hit that subscribe button too. We're closing into 30,000 subscribers, so if you want to become part of history and be one of the first 30,000 to join the channel, make sure you do so by hitting that subscribe button down below, and then that way you won't miss out on more crazy builds like this. Other than that, I have pretty much said everything that I need to say, so in that case, thank you all so much for watching this video. I really do appreciate it. Obviously, go have fun with this build. Let me know how you get on if you do happen to use it. But for now, I guess I will catch you in the next video of whatever it is that we make. Bye bye.